Hi guys, here's a question. Have you ever faced a moment where one decision could change everything? My name is Gaius Julius Caesar, and at the Rubicon I confronted that very choice. I knew crossing that shallow river would mean civil war and reshape Rome. But why did I proceed? What thoughts raced through my mind as I prepared to break Roman law? Listen closely as I recount the night that changed my life and the faith of the Roman Republic. But before we set out on this challenging journey together, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'm also curious to know where you're tuning in from and which figure from Italy's fascinating history inspires you most. Share your thoughts in the comments and perhaps their stories will be told in a future episode. Now that everything's settled, it's time to relax, dim the lights, let the world's noise fade, and come with me as we journey back through time. The night is quiet, the year is 49 BC, and our story begins not at the river, but weeks earlier in the conquered lands of Gaul. The camp in Gaul felt different that final week. We had achieved what no Roman general had accomplished before: the complete pacification of Transalpine Gaul after 8 long years of campaign. The victory should have tasted sweet, but there was a bitterness in the air. My tent stood at the centre of the camp, maps of Italy spread across the table where Gaulish maps had rested just days before. The soldiers went about their duties with quiet efficiency, but their eyes kept drifting southward. They knew. We all knew. Peace had come to Gaul, but storm clouds gathered over Rome. The letter arrived on a crisp morning, carried by a mud-spattered messenger who had ridden hard from the capital. The Senate seal felt heavy in my hands. As I broke it, I already knew what it would contain. The ultimatum: disband your army, return to Rome as a private citizen, face trial for your actions. They thought they had me cornered. Pompey, my former friend and son-in-law, now stood with my enemies in the Senate. Cato and his conservatives had finally manoeuvred me into what they thought was a checkmate position. They demanded I give up my imperium, my command, my legions, the very things that kept me safe from their vengeance. I stepped out of my tent and watched my men. The 10th Legion drilled in the distance, their movements precise and powerful. These were not just soldiers, they were veterans who had followed me through countless battles. They had shed blood for Rome in forests and mountains far from home. They trusted me to see them through to proper retirement, to the land grants and honours they had earned. How could I abandon them to the mercy of politicians who saw them as mere tools to be discarded? The centurions watched me with steady eyes. Lucius Vorenus, who had held the line against the Nervii, Titus Pullo, who had fought his way through Ambiorix's ambush. They waited for my decision, their loyalty absolute, their futures depending on my next move. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. We began the journey south with a small escort, just the 13th Legion and some cavalry. The roads were cold and empty as we moved through the winter landscape. Each step south felt heavier than the last. I rode at the head of the column, my scarlet cloak wrapped tight against the chill. My thoughts kept returning to the Republic. Not the corrupt Senate of today, but the ideal of Rome that I had always believed in. The Rome that gave opportunities to men of talent, not just birth. The Rome that rewarded merit and service. Was I betraying that ideal by crossing the Rubicon? Or was I saving it from the small-minded men who had hijacked it for their own interests? The countryside unfolded around us. Sleeping villages, bare vineyards, frost-covered fields. Farmers watched us pass from a distance, their expressions unreadable. They had known both war and peace under my campaigns in Gaul. Their sons had served in my legions. Their taxes had funded our expeditions. What did they think of this general marching toward Rome with his army? The simplicity of their lives stood in stark contrast to the complexity of my position. I was caught between my duty to Rome and my duty to my men, between the law and what I believed was right. The further we travelled, the more I realised there was no turning back. The machinery of politics had been set in motion, and like a stone already rolling downhill, we could only move forward toward whatever awaited us at the river's edge. As we rode south through the winter landscape, my mind kept returning to another general who had marched on Rome decades earlier. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the man whose shadow still fell across Roman politics like a long evening darkness. I was just a boy when Sulla seized power, but I remember the fear that gripped the city. The proscriptions lists posted in the forum, names of citizens declared enemies of the state, the property confiscations, the executions without trial, the smell of smoke from houses burning as old scores were settled under the guise of law. I remember my own narrow escape, how my mother's family connections barely saved me from Sulla's purge when he demanded I divorce Cornelia. I refused. Of course, even then, I understood that some principles were worth risking everything for. That memory stayed with me as we approached the Rubicon. Sulla had crossed his own Rubicon, in a manner of speaking, when he marched his legions into Rome to fight Gaius Marius. He claimed he was saving the Republic, just as I told myself I was doing now. But look what followed. The dictatorship, the blood in the streets, the erosion of traditions that had held Rome together for centuries. Sulla eventually stepped down, retired to write his memoirs, but the damage was done. The precedent was set. A general could use his army to settle political disputes. The sanctity of the Republic's institutions had been broken. I made a vow to myself during those dark days of my youth. I would never become another Sulla. I would not rule through fear, would not fill the Tiber with the bodies of my opponents. Yet here I was, leading soldiers toward Rome, just as he had done. The irony tasted bitter. Was I truly different? Or does power inevitably corrupt even the best intentions? The Republic was sick. Everyone could see that. The Senate had become a club for wealthy aristocrats to protect their privileges. The common people suffered under crushing debt while a few families grew unimaginably rich. The provincial governors exploited their subjects without consequence. Something had to change. But can one break the rules to save the system? That was the question that haunted me as we drew closer to the river. If I crossed with my army, I would be violating Rome's most fundamental law. I would be setting a precedent that might destroy the very republic I wanted to reform. Yet if I didn't cross, if I disbanded my army and returned to Rome as the Senate demanded, I would be walking into a political trial rigged against me. My enemies wouldn't stop until they destroyed me and everything I had built. They would undo the reforms I had passed, would punish my supporters, would likely send my veterans away without the rewards they had earned through blood and sacrifice. The cold air seemed to carry whispers from the past as we rode. I could almost hear Sulla's ghost asking me what made me think I was different. Power changes people. That's what history teaches us. The absolute power of commanding legions, of deciding life and death for thousands, changes how one sees the world. Had 8 years in Gaul changed me? Undoubtedly. I had grown accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed instantly. I had made decisions that affected entire tribes and territories. Could I truly return to being just another senator arguing in the forum? Or had the field of command reshaped me into something that could no longer fit within Rome's political structures? These thoughts circled in my mind as the landscape slowly changed around us. We were leaving the wilder northern territories and entering properly Roman lands, well-maintained roads, frequent way stations, villages that looked toward Rome for law and culture. The people here were Romans, not Gallic tribesmen. Would they see me as a liberator or an invader? Sulla had been welcomed by some and feared by others. I told myself my cause was just, that I sought to restore the Republic to its true principles, to break the stranglehold of the oligarchs, to give Rome back to its people. But then, I supposed every man who ever seized power told himself similar stories. The road ahead seemed to stretch into darkness, and with each mile, the ghost of Sulla rode closer at my side. The journey south unfolded like a slow unwinding of fate itself. We moved through the Italian countryside in the depth of winter, our breath misting in the cold air. The landscape seemed to hold its breath as we passed. Bare vineyards stood like skeletal hands reaching for the grey sky, and the olive groves were silvered with frost. My small escort of the 13th Legion moved with the quiet efficiency of veterans who had marched across half of Gaul together. There was no need for shouted orders. They knew their duties, knew the rhythm of the march, knew the unspoken truth that we were crossing into territory where every step forward changed everything. My officers rode beside me, their faces set in that particular mask soldiers wear when they know battle approaches but cannot yet see the enemy. They would glance at me occasionally, waiting for some sign, some revelation of what came next. We spoke in low tones during rest stops, huddled around campfires that seemed too small against the vast winter landscape. They asked practical questions about supplies, about potential resistance, about the condition of the roads ahead. But beneath those practical concerns lay the real question. Were we marching to save Rome or to conquer it? I gave them the answers I'd given myself, that sometimes boundaries must be crossed to preserve what they protect. As the days passed, a quiet realization settled over our company. There truly was no turning back now. Every mile south placed us further beyond the point where we could claim this was merely a precautionary movement. The messengers we sent ahead to friendly towns, the supplies we arranged, the intelligence we gathered about Pompey's dispositions. All these actions wove a web of commitment that trapped us as much as it prepared our path. I found myself watching the landscape with new eyes, noticing how the light changed over the hills, how the patterns of frost differed from Gaul, how the very air smelled of home. This was Italy, the heartland I claimed to be protecting, and I was bringing armed force into her peaceful valleys. The simplicity of the farmers' lives we passed stood in stark contrast to the complexity of our position. Men attending winter flocks, women carrying water from wells, children playing with sticks in the frozen mud. They watched us with curiosity but without apparent fear. They'd seen soldiers before, but these were Roman soldiers on Roman soil, and that made all the difference. Or did it? Would they still watch calmly if they knew we marched toward potential conflict with other Romans? The thought haunted me. I had always believed I acted for people like these. The ordinary citizens crushed between wealthy landlords and corrupt tax collectors. But would they see it that way when swords were drawn? There's a moment in any great undertaking when momentum takes over from decision. It's like a stone that begins rolling downhill. At first you can stop it with effort, but once it gains speed, it develops its own irresistible force. I felt that transition happening as we moved south. The initial decision to leave Gaul had been mine alone, but now thousands of lives were caught up in the motion. My soldiers, their families waiting back home, the communities we would pass through, the whole intricate web of Roman society. Each day's march added weight to that rolling stone, making it harder to divert from the path ahead. The road itself became a kind of meditation. The steady rhythm of hooves on stone, the creak of leather harnesses, the distant sound of marching boots. These formed a backdrop to my thoughts. I found myself remembering my youth, my early days in politics, the ideals that had driven me then. Had I changed, or had Rome changed around me? The republic I loved seemed to be crumbling from within, consumed by the very men who claimed to be its guardians. Perhaps the stone had been set rolling long before I placed my foot in the stirrup to begin this journey. Perhaps all of us, Pompey, Cato, Cicero, myself, were just following paths laid down by history itself, playing roles in a drama whose ending none of us could truly see. As we camped each night, I would walk among the soldiers, listening to their conversations, sharing their simple meals. They spoke of home, of families, of farms they hoped to own someday. Their trust in me was absolute, their belief in our cause unshaken. They saw me not as a revolutionary breaking laws, but as their commander leading them to secure what they had rightfully earned. In their straightforward view of the world, right and wrong were clear concepts. Either your commander looked after you or he didn't. Either Rome honoured its promises or it didn't. Their simple faith sometimes shamed my complex calculations. They followed because they trusted I would do right by them. And that trust became the heaviest weight of all, heavier than any political consequence, any historical judgment. However this ended, I could not betray the men who had given me everything. The river appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, a silver ribbon cutting through the winter landscape. The Rubicon, wider than I expected, darker, moving with a quiet power that felt appropriate for the boundary it represented. I reined in my horse and simply watched the water flow. This shallow stream, this geographical accident, held more power at that moment than any army or senate. It was just water over stones, yet it represented the ultimate line, the legal boundary no general could cross with armed forces. To step across was to declare war on Rome herself. The cold seemed to intensify as I dismounted and walked to the water's edge. My boots crunched on the frozen ground. The soldiers behind me had stopped as well, maintaining a respectful distance. They understood the significance of this moment. I could feel their eyes on my back, waiting. The water swirled in eddies and currents, carrying leaves and twigs southward toward the sea. How many times had I crossed this river before? Dozens, perhaps. To Rome for political business, back to my provinces to resume command, but never like this, never with soldiers at my back and war in my heart. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes. The weight of the decision pressed down on me physically. My armour felt heavier than ever before. The scarlet cloak that usually billowed with purpose now hung limp in the still air. I found myself studying the opposite bank, just more Italian countryside, no different from what stood behind me. Yet everything was different. That side represented law, tradition, the old ways. This side represented what? Rebellion, revolution, or necessary reform? The definitions mattered less than the action itself. Once crossed, the meaning would be decided by others, by history. My mind drifted to the legal technicalities I had studied as a young man. The Rubicon marked the boundary between my province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. As proconsul, I held imperium, the right of command north of this river. The moment I crossed southward with soldiers under arms, that legal protection vanished. I would become what my enemies called me, an outlaw, a rebel. Yet staying north meant accepting their terms, surrendering to a system that had become corrupt beyond saving. The river seemed to mock me with its simplicity, just water flowing where it always had, while I struggled with complexities of my own making. I knelt and dipped my hand into the water. The cold was shocking, immediate. It felt like truth itself, clear, bracing, undeniable. This was the moment I'd been moving toward for years, perhaps for my entire life. Every political battle, every military campaign, every alliance forged and broken had led to this riverbank. I thought of my daughter Julia, dead these 3 years, whose marriage to Pompey had once united us. I thought of Crassus, consumed by Parthian desert sands. I thought of Cato's unbending righteousness, Cicero's elegant doubts, Pompey's wounded pride. All of us, in our way, had contributed to bringing Rome to this precipice. The sky began to darken toward evening, painting the water in shades of lead and silver. A strange calm settled over me as I watched the light change. The doubts, the fears, the political calculations, they all fell away, leaving only the essential truth. I could not abandon my men to the mercy of my enemies. I could not let the oligarchs strangle the republic I loved. I could not turn back from the path that fate and fortune had set before me. The river would be crossed. The die would be cast. The consequences would be what they would be. I rose from the water's edge, my hand dripping and numb, and turned to face my soldiers. Their eyes met mine, and in that silent exchange, everything was decided without a single word spoken. That moment at the river didn't emerge from nothing. It grew from seeds planted decades earlier, when I was just a young man trying to make my way in Rome's complex political world. I remember my first steps into public life, not as a military commander, but as a lawyer and advocate. The corruption I witnessed in the courts shocked me. Wealthy defendants could buy their acquittals, while poor men faced judgment without representation. I made a name for myself taking cases that others avoided, defending victims of powerful families. Each victory felt like striking a small blow for justice in a system tilted toward the privileged. My early political posts followed the same pattern. As quaestor in Spain, I saw how provincial governors exploited their subjects for personal wealth. As a DL, I organised games and festivals not just for spectacle, but to show the people that their leaders could provide beauty and celebration alongside bread. Every step up the political ladder revealed deeper rot within our system. The Senate, once the guardian of Roman virtue, had become a club for wealthy families to protect their interests. The common people, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the veterans, were being crushed between high taxes and powerful landlords. The land reform issue became my first major battle. Veterans who had fought Rome's wars returned home to find their farms seized by creditors, their families homeless. Meanwhile, a handful of aristocratic families controlled vast estates worked by slaves. I proposed redistributing public lands to these veterans, not taking private property, but using state-owned territories that wealthy senators had effectively stolen through corruption. The opposition was immediate and furious. They called me a radical, a demagogue, a threat to the established order. But when I looked at those old senators defending their ill-gotten estates, I didn't see guardians of tradition. I saw greedy men clinging to privileges they didn't deserve. My methods were always constitutional, always within the system. I used popular assemblies to bypass Senate obstruction, believing that the people's voice should matter in a republic. I built alliances with other reformers, men who saw that Rome needed change to survive. We weren't revolutionaries, we were trying to save the republic from itself. The old families saw any challenge to their power as treason. They used every trick: legal delays, character assassination, even violence, to maintain their control. I learned early that fighting corruption meant getting your hands dirty in the process. The personal cost was high. I accumulated massive debts funding public games and projects to build popular support. My marriage alliances were strategic moves in this political chess game. Even my time as Pontifex Maximus, High Priest of Rome's state religion, was part of this larger struggle. Religion, law, politics, they were all interconnected in maintaining the established order. To reform one required challenging all. Through it all, I never lost sight of the central idea. Rome should be a republic where talent and service mattered more than birth and wealth, where the common citizen had a voice, where the state served the people, not the other way around. Those early years shaped everything that followed. The ideals I formed then, of justice, of meritocracy, of a republic true to its original principles, these were the same ideals that eventually brought me to the Rubicon. The river wasn't just about military command or personal survival. It was about whether those early dreams of reform could survive the entrenched power of the oligarchs. I had tried working within the system for decades. I had passed laws, won elections, built alliances. But the old families always found ways to block real change. As I stood watching that dark water flow, I wasn't just considering crossing a physical boundary. I was contemplating whether the system could still be saved from within, or whether it needed to be shaken to its foundations to be rebuilt properly. The young reformer in me still believed change was possible. The seasoned commander knew what price might be required. The alliance with Pompey and Crassus began not as a cynical power grab, but as a practical solution to Senate obstruction. We three represented different power bases: Pompey with his military reputation and veteran support, Crassus with his vast wealth and business connections, myself with growing popular appeal and political skill. Together we could achieve what none of us could accomplish alone: break the Senate's stranglehold on legislation and appointments. I still remember our first private meeting at my house, the three of us recognizing that our individual ambitions could align toward common goals. We weren't friends exactly, but we respected each other's strengths. Our agreement was simple yet profound. We would support each other's initiatives and block any legislation that harmed our collective interests. I helped secure land grants for Pompey's veterans from his eastern campaigns. Pompey supported my consular agenda when my term began. Crassus used his financial influence to smooth over political opposition. For a few years, it worked remarkably well. We pushed through laws that the Senate had blocked for decades: tax reforms, infrastructure projects, provincial administration improvements. The Republic actually functioned better with our unofficial guidance than it had with the Senate's endless debates and vetoes. But alliances built on shared interests rather than shared values contain inherent tensions. Pompey grew uncomfortable with my rising popularity with the common people. Crassus resented that military glory still counted more than wealth in Roman politics. I found myself constantly mediating between their competing egos while advancing my own position. The marriage to my daughter Julia helped. She genuinely loved Pompey, and he adored her. For a few precious years, that personal bond kept our political alliance strong. But when Julia died in childbirth, the personal connection shattered, leaving only the brittle framework of political convenience. Crassus's disastrous campaign in Parthia changed everything. His death in the desert sands removed the balancing force between Pompey and myself. Without Crassus's wealth and influence, without Julia's gentle mediation, our alliance became a competition. Pompey drifted toward the conservative senators he had once opposed, finding common cause with men like Cato who feared my growing power. The Senate, seeing their opportunity, flattered Pompey's vanity and played on his suspicions. They offered him what I never could, sole preeminence in Rome, with me removed from the picture. Looking back, I see how inevitable the unravelling was. We had created a system that depended on 3 pillars standing together. Remove one, and the whole structure becomes unstable. The tragedy wasn't that our alliance ended, but that it had to end as it began, as a practical arrangement rather than a shared vision for Rome. We had temporarily bypassed the Senate's corruption, but we hadn't created anything lasting to replace it. The first triumvirate proved that Rome could be governed effectively, but it also revealed how personal ambitions could undermine even the most practical partnerships. When I stood at the Rubicon, part of me was still mourning what might have been if 3 strong men had truly worked together for Rome's future, rather than their own. The hardest part wasn't the political calculation or the military implications, it was the personal hurt. Pompey and I had been more than allies, we had been family. When he married my daughter Julia, it felt like our partnership had grown roots that would survive any political storm. I remember watching them together, the great general softened by her gentle presence, the young woman glowing with pride in her famous husband. Her death created a void that no political agreement could ever fill. The letters between us grew formal, distant. The easy camaraderie vanished, replaced by careful phrasing and unspoken suspicions. Pompey's drift toward my enemies felt like a physical wound. I would receive reports from Rome, Pompey dining with Cato, Pompey supporting Senate motions against my interests, Pompey quietly moving legions toward Italy. Each piece of news landed like a blow. This was the man who had stood beside me against Senate obstruction, who had benefited from my political support, who had shared bread and wine at my table. The betrayal wasn't just political, it felt deeply personal. I kept asking myself what I had missed, what signs I should have seen, whether Julia's death had broken something in him that couldn't be repaired. The rational part of me understood his calculations. The Senate offered him what I couldn't, sole preeminence in Rome. Without Crassus balancing our power dynamic, without Julia binding us together, we'd become rivals by default. Pompey had always been uncomfortable sharing the spotlight. His military triumphs in the East had made him Rome's greatest general, until my campaigns in Gaul began capturing public imagination. I think what bothered him most wasn't the threat to his power, but to his legend. He couldn't bear the thought of another man matching his glory. Yet understanding his motivations didn't lessen the sting. There's a particular pain when someone who knows your strengths and weaknesses turns that knowledge against you. Pompey understood my attachment to my soldiers, my commitment to my veterans, my belief in popular support over aristocratic approval. He used all these understandings expertly. The Senate's ultimatum, disband your army or be declared an enemy, bore Pompey's strategic fingerprints. He knew I wouldn't abandon my men. He knew I believed in my popular mandate. He was forcing me into a choice where either outcome served his purposes. I found myself remembering specific moments. A conversation after dinner where he praised my Gallic campaigns, a letter he wrote thanking me for supporting his veteran settlement, the time he stood as godfather to my nephew. Were those all calculations? Was there ever genuine friendship beneath the political convenience? The doubt gnawed at me during those long rides south toward the Rubicon. Perhaps the greatest betrayal wasn't his alliance with my enemies, but the revelation that our bond had always been thinner than I believed. The tragedy was that we might have saved the Republic together. With our combined influence, his military reputation, my political skills, our shared popular support, we could have implemented the reforms Rome desperately needed. Instead, we became the two halves of a civil war that would tear the Republic apart. As I stood by that dark river, part of me still hoped for a last-minute message from Pompey, some sign that he remembered what we had built together. But no message came, only the cold water flowing and the understanding that some crossings change everything forever. The voices that truly mattered weren't the ones echoing in the Senate chamber. They were the ones in the streets, the markets, the fields of Italy. As I stood there at the river's edge, I found myself remembering the faces of ordinary Romans who had looked to me as their champion, the veterans I had promised land to after their service, the common citizens crushed by debt who needed relief, the provincial subjects suffering under corrupt governors. These were the people the Senate had forgotten, the ones they considered beneath their notice. I had always believed that a republic should serve all its citizens, not just the wealthy few. There was a particular moment in the forum that always came back to me. I had just passed a law reducing debt burdens for struggling families, and an old farmer approached me with tears in his eyes. He told me he could now keep his land, that his children wouldn't be sold into servitude to pay his creditors. That moment, that raw gratitude from someone who had nothing but his dignity, meant more to me than any Senate decree or military victory. It reminded me why I had entered politics in the first place, to make Rome work for all Romans, not just the privileged class born in marble houses. The Senate called my popularity with the common people demagoguery. They said I was buying support with bread and circuses, but they never understood that what I offered wasn't just entertainment or temporary relief. It was dignity, a chance for ordinary citizens to have a voice in their own government, a system where merit mattered more than ancestry. The crowds that gathered when I spoke, the letters that arrived from every province, the quiet support from people who had never set foot in the forum. These weren't signs of manipulation. They were evidence that Rome hungered for change. As I contemplated crossing the Rubicon, I kept asking myself, who really spoke for the Republic? Was it the handful of aristocrats in the Senate who thought they owned Rome by birthright? Or was it the millions of citizens across Italy and the provinces who believed in the Republic's ideals but saw them betrayed daily by their leaders? My mandate didn't come from Senate appointments or legal technicalities. It came from the people who had supported my reforms, who had served in my legions, who believed I could restore Rome to its true purpose. The irony was that my opponents saw themselves as defending the Republic while I threatened it. But what were they defending? A system where a few families controlled everything, where corruption was standard practice, where the common good mattered less than personal privilege. The Republic I believed in was the one founded on principles of shared governance and civic virtue. That Republic had been dying for years, suffocated by the very men who now claimed to be its protectors. Perhaps crossing the Rubicon wasn't an attack on the Republic, but a desperate attempt to save it from its supposed guardians. There's a quiet truth that every leader eventually faces. You can either serve the people or serve the powerful. Rarely can you do both. The Senate represented the powerful, the established families, the wealthy landowners, the political insiders. My support came from the people, the soldiers, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the ordinary citizens who believed Rome could be better. as I stood there with the cold river before me, I realised this choice had been coming for years. Not just about legal boundaries or military commands, but about who Rome truly belonged to. The water flowing south toward Rome seemed to carry that question with it. Whose voice would determine the future? The few in their marble halls, or the many in their humble homes? My eyes travelled along the ranks of soldiers waiting behind me. These men had followed me through 8 years of brutal campaigning in Gaul, through frozen winters and bloody battles, through hunger and hardship that would break lesser men. They trusted me not just with their lives, but with their futures. The retirement bonuses, the land grants, the honourable discharge they had earned through blood and sacrifice. All this depended on my leadership. If I surrendered to the Senate's demands, what would become of them? The politicians in Rome saw soldiers as tools to be used and discarded, but I knew each man's name, each man's story. There was Lucius, the centurion who had held the line against the Nervi when all seemed lost. There was Marcus, the standard-bearer who had waded through chest-deep water to plant our eagle on British soil. These weren't just soldiers. They were fathers hoping to return to families, farmers dreaming of working their own land, citizens who believed they were serving Rome's greater glory. How could I abandon them to the mercy of men like Cato, who considered military service a necessary evil rather than an honourable calling? The weight of their trust felt heavier than any armour I had ever worn. I thought of the promises I'd made around campfires in Gaul. I had looked these men in the eyes and sworn that their service would be rewarded, that Rome would honour its debts to them. That promise became my sacred duty. The Senate's ultimatum wasn't just a political challenge. It was a betrayal of these men who had given everything for Rome. If I crossed the Rubicon, I would be breaking one law to keep faith with a higher obligation. If I didn't cross, I would be keeping technical legality while breaking my word to the very men who had made Rome's expansion possible. The 13th Legion stood particularly still, their discipline absolute even in this moment of uncertainty. They had been with me from the beginning, through every campaign. They knew the significance of this river as well as I did. Yet not a man hesitated, not a voice questioned. Their faith in my judgment was both humbling and terrifying. They believed I would lead them to honour and security, whatever path that required. That belief became the compass that finally settled my decision. However history judged me, I would not be the commander who abandoned his men to political vengeance. Like a shepherd responsible for his flock, I had led these men through danger and now faced the ultimate test of that stewardship. The Senate saw numbers and legions. I saw individuals who had trusted me with their lives. However the political calculations fell, however the historians might judge, this much was simple and true. I would not betray the men who had never betrayed me. The water continued to flow, but my course was now clear. The letters from Cicero arrived like autumn leaves, beautifully written, carefully reasoned, and ultimately fragile against the winds of change. I still have them somewhere in my papers, those elegant scrolls filled with his perfect prose. He urged caution, compromise, constitutional solutions. There is always a path within the law, he wrote, as if the law hadn't been twisted into a weapon by my enemies. I respected Cicero's mind, his devotion to the Republic's forms and traditions. But he was a philosopher trying to play chess with men who played with daggers. His arguments were intellectually compelling but politically naive. He believed that if reasonable men sat down together, they could find a solution that satisfied all parties. He didn't understand that Cato and his faction didn't want compromise. They wanted my destruction. They had rigged the system so completely that playing by their rules meant accepting my own political death and the ruin of my supporters. Cicero's letters spoke of honour and tradition while my enemies prepared proscription lists. His elegant phrases couldn't protect my veterans from being stripped of their hard-earned pensions. I remember one particular passage where he wrote, "No cause is so just that it justifies civil war." The words sounded noble, but they ignored the reality that sometimes the system becomes so corrupt that working within it means perpetuating injustice. What was I to tell my soldiers? That they must accept betrayal because the forms of legality demanded it? That their 8 years of service counted for nothing against the political games of aristocrats who had never faced a Gallic charge? Cicero lived in a world of ideas, but I lived in a world of consequences. There was tragedy in his position. The intellectual who sees all sides clearly, but cannot grasp that some conflicts have no middle ground. He wanted to save the Republic through debate and reason, but the Republic was already dying from the poison of corruption and privilege. His warnings came from a genuine love of Rome, but they presumed a system that no longer functioned as intended. The constitution he revered had become a shield for the very forces destroying what made the Republic great. As I stood by the Rubicon, Cicero's words echoed in my mind like the voice of conscience. Part of me wished I could believe in his vision of reasoned compromise, but another part knew that sometimes the ship is so rotten that patching individual holes only delays the inevitable sinking. The Republic needed more than temporary fixes, it needed fundamental renewal. And sometimes, renewal requires breaking what exists to build something better. Cicero saw the breaking as the tragedy. I came to see it as the necessary surgery before healing could begin. The greatest sadness was that both of us wanted the same thing, a strong, virtuous Rome that lived up to its ideals. We simply disagreed on whether those ideals could still be reached through the existing structures. His warnings were the voice of the Rome that had been. My crossing would be the step toward the Rome that might be. Neither of us could know which path would ultimately serve the Republic better. History would judge, but in that moment by the dark water, with my soldiers waiting, I had to choose between a philosopher's wisdom and a commander's duty. The cold truth was that sometimes action must precede perfect understanding. Alone by the river in the deepening darkness, the world narrowed to the sound of water moving over stones and the cold seeping through my armour. The soldiers had withdrawn to a respectful distance, giving me this final space for contemplation. In the quiet, I could almost hear the whispers of all the versions of myself that had led to this moment. The ambitious young advocate, the reforming politician, the victorious general. Each had believed they were serving Rome, yet each had brought me closer to this ultimate violation of her laws. The weight of 50 years pressed down on me, not just the physical years, but the accumulated decisions, alliances, betrayals and triumphs. I remembered my first speech in the Forum, voice shaking with nervous passion. The early morning studying law until my eyes burned. The first time I led soldiers into battle and understood the terrible responsibility of command. Every choice had been a stone placed on the path that led to this riverbank. Had I been steering my destiny, or had destiny been steering me? The cold night air felt like truth itself, clear, unyielding, indifferent to my rationalizations. However noble my intentions, however corrupt my opponents, the fact remained. I was about to lead Roman soldiers against Rome. The ghost of Sulla seemed to breathe in the darkness beside me, his example both warning and temptation. Could I cross this boundary without becoming what he had been? Could I break the rules to save the system without destroying what made it worth saving? Time became fluid in that darkness. each moment stretching and contracting. I found myself reviewing not just my political calculations, but the human cost, the faces of men who would die because of this decision, the families that would mourn, the traditions that would shatter. Yet balanced against this were the faces of my veterans, men who had given their youth to Rome and deserved better than abandonment, the common citizens crushed by a system that favoured the wealthy, the Republic itself sick and needing desperate medicine. There's a moment when all the arguments, all the justifications, all the fears dissolve into simple clarity. The point of no return isn't a place on a map or a line in the law. It's a quiet click within the soul when you understand that some choices once made cannot be unmade. Some paths, once taken, define everything that follows. The water continued its endless flow, carrying the past toward the future, indifferent to the general standing on its banks contemplating the unthinkable. The decision was no longer about politics or strategy. It was about what kind of man I would be when history asked its final question. The darkness felt complete around me, that deep rural blackness where the only light comes from the stars and the faint glow of our campfires reflected on the water. I had sent the officers away, needing this final solitude before the decision. The cold seeped through my cloak, matching the chill in my soul. I found myself looking upward, not in prayer exactly, but in that human need for some sign when the path ahead is unclear. The stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the troubles of one man standing by a river. Then I saw it, a streak of light crossing the sky, a meteor burning through the atmosphere with sudden, brilliant intensity. It flashed from north to south, exactly the direction we needed to travel, leaving a momentary trail of fire that seemed to point the way. In that moment, superstition and calculation met in perfect alignment. Romans have always read the heavens for signs. We believe the gods speak through natural wonders. This felt like more than coincidence. The timing, the direction, the sheer dramatic suddenness of it. Everything aligned with what my rational mind had already decided. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whether it was actual divine approval or simply fortune favouring my choice, the message felt clear. The path forward was sanctioned by forces greater than Senate decrees or political calculations. The doubt that had plagued me vanished, replaced by that clarity that comes when faith overwhelms hesitation. The soldiers had seen it too. I heard their murmurs from the camp, the awed whispers as they pointed skyward. For men about to embark on a dangerous campaign, such signs matter. They would carry that memory of the burning sky into whatever battles lay ahead, believing the gods marched with us. Sometimes leadership means recognizing when superstition can serve strategy, when faith can reinforce resolve. That meteor became our banner in the darkness, our confirmation that we moved with destiny rather than against it. The cold water suddenly seemed less forbidding, the opposite bank less distant. The sign I hadn't known I was waiting for had arrived, and with it came the final piece of certainty I needed to take that first step into the water. The water was colder than I expected, the shock of it cutting through my boots and stealing my breath. That first step into the Rubicon felt like stepping through a veil between worlds. The current tugged at my legs, insistently pulling southward as if the river itself approved of our direction. I didn't look back at the soldiers. I didn't need to. I heard the first splashes as they followed without hesitation, their discipline holding even in this moment of profound transgression. The water swirled around our knees, dark and purposeful, carrying us toward whatever fate awaited on the opposite shore. Each step forward felt both terrifying and liberating. The physical sensation of cold water rising, The weight of my armour trying to anchor me in place, the gradual progress toward the far bank, all these mundane details somehow magnified the historical weight of the moment. This wasn't a battle charge or a political speech, it was simply putting one foot in front of the other through moving water. Yet each step took us further from legality and deeper into rebellion. The simplicity of the action contrasted sharply with the complexity of its consequences. Midway across, I paused and turned to see the column stretching behind me. Hundreds of men moving steadily through the water, their faces set with determination. Not a single soldier had hesitated. Their trust was absolute, their belief in our cause unshaken. In that moment I understood that crossing the Rubicon wasn't just my decision alone. It was a choice made collectively by every man who followed me into that dark water. We were bound together now by this shared act of defiance, this collective step into the unknown. The opposite bank rose before us, just bare earth and winter grass. No different from the shore we had left behind, yet everything was different now. As my foot touched dry ground on the Italian side, I felt the shift instantly. The legal protection of my command was gone. I was now an outlaw in the eyes of Roman law, a rebel general leading soldiers against the state. The air itself seemed changed, charged with the electricity of what we had done. I turned to face my men as they emerged from the water, dripping and solemn. "The die is cast," I said quietly, though the words felt inadequate for the moment. We had crossed the boundary that could not be uncrossed, and now there was only forward. The first town beyond the river lay quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, its walls barely visible against the fading stars. Ariminum, a prosperous market town that normally would be stirring with early merchants and farmers heading to fields. Instead, an unnatural stillness hung over the place as we approached. I had sent scouts ahead to ensure no ambush awaited, but the reports came back puzzling. The gates stood unguarded, the watchtowers empty. As we drew closer, I could make out faces peering from windows, but no soldiers manned the walls, no officials came to challenge us. The town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what this armed crossing would mean. We entered through the main gate without resistance, our footsteps echoing strangely in the silent streets. The townspeople watched from doorways and shutters, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This was the moment I had dreaded and anticipated, the first test of whether Italy would see us as liberators or invaders. An old man approached, his back bent with years but his eyes clear. "Are you here to harm us?" he asked simply. I dismounted and looked him in the eye. "We come to restore the Republic's true principles," I told him. "No harm will come to any peaceful citizen." The relief on his face told me everything I needed to know about what rumours had preceded us. The town officials emerged cautiously from the basilica, their formal robes looking oddly theatrical in the tense atmosphere. They offered the keys to the city without protest, their hands trembling slightly. I refused them. "Keep your authority," I said. "Administer your town as always. My soldiers need only provisions and safe passage." Their surprise was genuine. They had expected plunder or punishment, not respect for local governance. As word spread, the atmosphere began to change. Shutters opened fully. People emerged into the streets, and the normal sounds of a waking town gradually returned. The bakery reopened, the smell of fresh bread mixing with the morning air. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their curiosity overcoming fear. This mixed reaction became the pattern as we moved south. The common people, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, mostly watched with cautious interest. They had heard of my reforms, of my support for debt relief and land redistribution. The local elites, the wealthy landowners and their supporters, either fled ahead of our advance or stayed behind with visible anxiety. I made a point of respecting property and local authorities wherever we passed, wanting to demonstrate that this was not a rebellion against Rome itself, but against the corrupt faction that had hijacked her government. The real validation came quietly, a farmer leaving baskets of apples for my soldiers, a widow offering water from her well, children bringing flowers to place on our temporary altars. These small gestures meant more than any official welcome. They told me that the people understood this was not an invasion, but a necessary correction. The Senate might panic in Rome, but the heart of Italy was watching and waiting to see who truly served its interests. The news of our crossing reached Rome like a summer storm, sudden, violent, and utterly transforming. My scouts brought reports of the chaos that erupted when word arrived that we had crossed the Rubicon. The Senate chamber, usually a place of measured debate and procedure, descended into panic. Senators who had been so bold in demanding my surrender now found their courage melting away. They had expected me to comply, to disband my legions and return to face their rigged trial. The reality of armed resistance shattered their assumptions. I could almost see them in my mind's eye, Cato's rigid righteousness crumbling into practical fear, Pompey's military confidence revealing its brittle core, the whole carefully constructed opposition unravelling at the seams. What surprised me most was how quickly they abandoned Rome itself. These men who claimed to be defending the Republic's heart simply fled when faced with actual danger. Pompey, my former ally and son-in-law, made the crucial error. He ordered the evacuation of Rome, declaring the city could not be defended. This single decision revealed everything about his leadership in crisis. A true defender of Rome would have fortified the city, rallied the people, made a stand for what he claimed to believe in. Instead, he ran, taking most of the Senate with him. Their hurried departure spoke louder than any speech about their true priorities. They weren't protecting Rome, they were protecting their own privileges and positions. The contrast between their panic and our steady advance could not have been more striking. While senators scrambled to gather their wealth and abandon the capital, my legions moved south with disciplined purpose. We took towns without bloodshed, respected local authorities, and maintained perfect order. The people watched this drama unfold. On one side, the aristocratic leadership fleeing in disorder. On the other, the supposed rebel general acting with restraint and respect for Roman law wherever possible. This visual contrast did more for our cause than any propaganda I could have devised. It showed ordinary Romans who truly valued the Republic, and who merely valued their own power. In their desperation, my opponents made another critical miscalculation. They assumed the Italian people would rise against me. They thought their conservative rhetoric about tradition and legality would rally the population to defend the established order. But the people had long memories. They remembered the proscriptions of Sulla's time, the corruption of the tax collectors, the arrogance of the aristocratic class. They saw the senators fleeing with their gold while common citizens were left to face whatever came. This wasn't the republic they believed in. This was privilege protecting itself at the people's expense. The panic in Rome became its own undoing, revealing the hollow core beneath the aristocratic facade. The true measure of our crossing revealed itself not in Senate decrees or military confrontations, but in the quiet responses of ordinary Italians as we continued south. Town after town opened their gates without resistance, not out of fear, but from something more profound, a weary acceptance that change was necessary. In Forum Julii, the town elders met us with bread and salt, their expressions not of submission, but of relief. "We've heard of your reforms in Gaul," one said simply. We could use such justice here. Their fields had been swallowed by wealthy senators' estates, their young men driven to debt slavery by corrupt tax collectors. They saw in our march not rebellion, but the possibility of restoration. This pattern repeated through the winter countryside. In Arretium, the people actually cheered our arrival, not the organised cheers of paid supporters, but the genuine voices of citizens who believed we represented their interests against the distant aristocracy. Farmers brought provisions to our camp not as tribute but as gifts between Romans. Veterans who had served under me in earlier campaigns emerged from retirement to offer their swords. The depth of this popular support surprised even me. I had known there was discontent, but I hadn't realised how deeply the Senate had alienated the people it claimed to govern. The contrast became our strongest argument. While Pompey and the aristocrats fortified themselves in wealthy villas or fled toward Greece, we moved through the heart of Italy with the people's blessing. Local militias formed not to resist us, but to join our progress. Town councils passed resolutions supporting our cause. This wasn't conquest, it was a quiet revolution, where the very citizens the Senate ignored became the foundation of our movement. Their validation felt more significant than any military victory. It answered the question that had haunted me at the Rubicon. Whose republic was I actually defending? The answer came in every loaf of bread offered, every gate opened, every quiet thank you from people who'd been invisible to their own government. This popular mandate forced me to confront a deeper question. When does rebellion become revolution? We had crossed the Rubicon to reform the system, not overthrow it. Yet the enthusiastic response suggested the people wanted more than mere reform. They wanted transformation. They saw in our march an opportunity to reset the balance between the powerful and the powerless. Their quiet support carried a weight of expectation that sometimes felt heavier than any military obligation. They weren't just allowing us to pass, they were investing in us their hopes for a different kind of Rome, one where their voices might finally be heard. Our movement south became a careful dance between speed and restraint. We moved quickly but deliberately, capturing key towns and crossroads without unnecessary violence. The strategy was simple yet profound. Demonstrate control without brutality, show strength without oppression. We secured grain supplies and storage facilities, not through seizure, but through fair purchase and proper documentation. This wasn't conquest. It was the establishment of an alternative administration that respected Roman law, even as we challenged its current guardians. The towns that welcomed us found their markets functioning normally, their local governments intact, their daily lives undisturbed except for the visible presence of disciplined soldiers who paid for what they needed. The real genius of the plan revealed itself in what we didn't do. We didn't pursue fleeing senators or their supporters. We didn't confiscate property or settle old scores. We didn't interfere with the harvest or disrupt the delicate winter preparations that kept Italy fed. This restraint confused our opponents almost as much as our advance. They expected plunder and punishment. They received orderly administration and respect for local customs. Each town that continued its normal life under our presence became a living argument against the Senate's portrayal of us as barbarian invaders. The people saw that the Republic could function even during political crisis, that military force and civil order could coexist. Like a careful chess player thinking several moves ahead, I focused on controlling the board rather than capturing pieces. The grain supplies ensured the people wouldn't suffer hunger that winter. The intact local governments maintained stability. The unbroken supply lines meant we could sustain our advance without burdening the communities we passed through. Every decision was measured against two questions. Does this serve our military needs, And does this demonstrate our commitment to proper governance? The balance was delicate. Too soft and we'd appear weak. Too harsh and we'd become the tyrants our opponents claimed. The silent approval of the common people, who continued their daily lives with minimal disruption, told me we'd found the right balance. The Senate's forces, by contrast, seemed to understand only brute force. They fortified positions we had no intention of attacking. They burned bridges we didn't need to cross. They concentrated on military show while we focused on practical control. This difference in approach became our greatest advantage. While they prepared for dramatic battles, we secured the actual functioning of Italy. The winter landscape became a chessboard where we captured squares not with siege engines, but with bread, order, and respect for the ordinary rhythms of Roman life. Each day that passed without chaos strengthened our position and weakened the argument that our crossing had endangered the Republic. The real threat to Rome, it increasingly seemed, wasn't our disciplined advance, but the panic and incompetence of those who had fled the capital. The news reached us at a small garrison town south of Ariminum, carried by a merchant who had witnessed the exodus himself. Pompey was abandoning Italy entirely, taking what remained of the Senate and their loyalist forces to Greece, where he believed he could raise a proper Eastern army to confront us. The report felt both like victory and tragedy. He was conceding Rome without a fight, proving his leadership was more about personal position than defending the Republic. Yet his retreat also meant the civil war would continue, spreading beyond Italy's borders. I thought of our past friendship, our shared victories, the family bond through Julia. That he would rather flee than find common ground spoke volumes about how far we had drifted from the ideals we once shared. His decision revealed a fundamental miscalculation. By abandoning Italy, he abandoned the very heart of the Republic he claimed to protect. The people watched their supposed defenders flee overseas while the rebel general maintained order and respected local governance. This visual contrast did more damage to his cause than any military defeat could have. I found myself both disappointed and relieved. Disappointed that he chose flight over reconciliation. Relieved that Rome might be spared the bloodshed of street fighting. The empty Senate house we would soon encounter would stand as permanent testimony to his failure of nerve when Rome needed steadfast leadership most. The strategic implications unfolded like a map in my mind. Greece meant time. Time for him to gather legions from the eastern provinces, time for political manoeuvring, time for foreign powers to intervene. But it also meant he had surrendered the moral high ground. How could he claim to defend Rome while fleeing from it? His retreat created an opportunity for us to take the capital peacefully, to show restraint and governance while he prepared for war abroad. The contrast would not be lost on the Roman people. One side administering Italy with care, the other gathering forces for invasion. Sometimes withdrawal is wiser than attack, but this felt less like strategy and more like fear disguised as tactics. As we continued south, the reality of his retreat became visible in the abandoned villas and empty stables along the route. The wealthy senators had fled with their most valuable possessions, leaving behind only the echo of their privilege. The common people watched this exodus with quiet judgment. They understood what it meant when leaders abandoned their people to save themselves. Pompey's greatest error wasn't military. It was forgetting that Rome belongs to those who stay and govern, not those who flee and scheme. His retreat across the sea became the final confirmation that our crossing had been necessary. The Republic needed defenders who would stand their ground, not aristocrats who would abandon their posts at the first sign of real danger. The city appeared through the winter haze, her 7 hills rising like a promise kept. We entered Rome not as conquerors but as citizens returning to a home that had been stolen from us by fear and corruption. The gate stood open, no defenders, no cheering crowds, just the eerie quiet of a city holding its breath. My horse's hooves echoed on the cobblestones of the Via Flaminia, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. This was the heart of the Republic, the centre of the world, and we had arrived without drawing a single sword in anger. The emptiness felt more accusing than any armed resistance would have. We passed through streets where shutters remained closed, where the only movement was the occasional face peering from a doorway before quickly disappearing. The normal bustle of Rome, the merchants shouting their wares, the lawyers hurrying to the forum, the children playing in the alleys, all had vanished, leaving behind a shell of a city waiting to see what we would become. I deliberately avoided the military route that would have taken us past the capital in show of force. Instead, we moved toward the quieter administrative districts, our presence meant to reassure rather than intimidate. The few people who did emerge watched with expressions I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, but a cautious waiting, as if testing the air after a storm. The Senate House stood empty when I finally approached it, its bronze doors slightly ajar as if the fathers of Rome had left in too much hurry to properly secure their chamber. I entered alone, the vast hall echoing with my footsteps. The curule chairs stood in perfect order. The mosaics of Rome's history stared up from the floor. The afternoon light slanted through high windows onto empty benches. This emptiness spoke louder than any debate that had ever filled this space. These men who claimed to be Rome's guardians had abandoned their posts when danger approached. They had fled not from an invading army, but from the consequences of their own corruption. I walked to the centre of the chamber where I had stood so many times as consul, as senator, as petitioner. The silence felt heavy with the ghosts of all the speeches given here, the noble arguments, the petty rivalries, the moments of true statesmanship buried under years of political games. Part of me had expected triumph in this moment, the satisfaction of having overcome my enemies. Instead, I felt only a profound sadness that it had come to this, that the Republic's great institutions could be so easily abandoned by those sworn to protect them. The victory felt hollow, the empty chairs accusing me even in their absence. That night, as I took residence in the official residence that had been prepared, I made a conscious decision to demonstrate restraint. No prescriptions lists were posted. No property was confiscated. The city's administration continued under its usual officials. We maintained order, ensured the grain distribution continued, kept the streets safe. The message was clear. We had come not to punish Rome, but to reclaim her from the men who had abandoned her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the city began to breathe again. Shutters opened. Markets returned. Children's laughter echoed in the alleys. The people were watching, waiting to see if our actions would match our words. And in their cautious return to normal life, I found the only validation that mattered. The empty Senate chamber echoed with more than just footsteps. It echoed with the ghosts of Republican ideals and the weight of what came next. As I stood there surrounded by vacant curule chairs, the question wasn't whether to govern, but how to govern without becoming the very thing I had crossed the Rubicon to oppose. The dictatorship offered a legal path, temporary emergency powers to restore order and implement reforms, but temporary power has a way of becoming permanent, and emergency measures have a habit of becoming standard practice. I remembered Sulla's dictatorship, how it began as a temporary necessity and ended with blood in the streets and property confiscations. That was not the path for Rome, nor for me. The people needed stability, not more uncertainty. The veterans deserved their rewards, the debtors needed relief, the provinces required honest governance. These practical necessities demanded clear authority, but how to exercise that authority without undermining the republican forms that made Rome great? I found myself walking through the forum at dawn, watching the first merchants set up their stalls, the water carriers heading to the fountains, the early risers beginning their day. Their normalcy mattered more than any political theory. They needed someone to ensure the grain ships kept arriving. The courts functioned fairly, the roads remained safe. The abstract debate about dictatorship versus republicanism meant less than these practical realities. I decided on a middle path, accepting the dictatorship temporarily, but with specific limitations and public commitments to restore normal governance once the emergency passed. The powers would be used not for personal glory, but for specific reforms: debt relief, land distribution for veterans, calendar correction, administrative reorganization. Each measure would be publicly justified, each power exercised with transparency. The contrast with Sulla's reign of terror would be clear. This wasn't about seizing power. It was about using necessary authority to heal what was broken, then returning that authority to its proper places. The true test wouldn't be in taking power, but in relinquishing it when the work was done. The empty Senate chamber would fill again, but with better laws and clearer principles. That was the promise I made to myself as I prepared to govern a city that was watching, waiting, and wondering what came after the crossing. The real work began not with grand speeches or military parades, but with the quiet, practical business of governance. Rome's administration had become like neglected stables, overflowing with corruption, inefficiency, and the accumulated waste of years of aristocratic privilege. My first days back in the city were spent not in celebration, but in assessment. I met with treasury officials, tax collectors, grain distributors, and infrastructure supervisors. The picture they painted was worse than I had imagined. The public coffers were nearly empty despite heavy taxation. Debt records showed ordinary citizens crushed under impossible burdens, while wealthy senators paid minimal taxes through loopholes and influence. The grain supply chain was riddled with middlemen taking cuts at every stage. This was the real Rome beneath the marble facade, a system designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many. The debt crisis demanded immediate attention. I summoned the account books and began reviewing them personally. The numbers told a story of desperation: farmers who had borrowed to survive bad harvests, shopkeepers who had taken loans to stay afloat during political instability, veterans who owed money to unscrupulous lenders charging outrageous interest. These weren't irresponsible debtors. They were victims of a system that protected creditors at all costs. I issued a comprehensive debt relief decree that winter, not cancelling debts entirely but restructuring them fairly. Interest already paid would be deducted from principal. Payments would be scaled to actual ability to pay. No citizen would lose their land or liberty over debts incurred through no fault of their own. The relief that swept through the city was palpable. You could see it in the way people stood straighter, in the return of hope to eyes that had been resigned to despair. Next came the veteran settlements. These men had fought Rome's wars for years, following me through Gaul's forests and Britain's mists. They had earned not just pay, but land and honour. I identified public lands that had been illegally occupied by wealthy families, and began the process of reclaiming them for proper distribution. Surveyors moved across Italy, mapping territories that would become new farms for retired soldiers. Each allocation was documented meticulously. This wasn't seizure, but rightful return of state property to its proper purpose. I made sure the veterans received not just land, but startup resources, tools, seeds, livestock, to begin their new lives. Watching these hardened soldiers become farmers, their swords exchanged for ploughs, felt more meaningful than any military victory. They were putting down roots literally and figuratively, becoming the stable backbone of a renewed Italy. The calendar reform began as a practical necessity but became something more. Our calendar had drifted so far out of alignment with the solar year that seasons no longer match their traditional months. Pre-scheduled festivals for wrong seasons, farmers planted by outdated markers, and the entire rhythm of Roman life had become disconnected from natural cycles. I brought in astronomers from Alexandria, their knowledge more advanced than our own. Together we designed a new calendar, the Julian calendar, that would keep proper time for centuries. The mathematics fascinated me, the elegant precision of matching human measurement to cosmic reality. When we implemented the change, adding months to correct the drift, it felt like bringing order to chaos itself. Time itself would now flow properly in Rome, a small but profound symbol that reason and organisation could overcome even the most entrenched disorder. Infrastructure received equal attention. Roads that had deteriorated under neglect were repaired. Aqueducts were cleaned and expanded to serve growing neighbourhoods. The forum's public spaces were restored to proper dignity. Each project employed local workers, putting coins in ordinary citizens' purses while improving the city they called home. I made a point of walking these projects personally, talking to the workers, listening to their suggestions. Governance, I realised, wasn't about grand decrees from marble chambers. It was about clean water flowing, roads that didn't break cart axles, markets that functioned fairly. The true test of our crossing wouldn't be on battlefields, but in these quiet improvements that made daily life better for the people who had placed their trust in us. The stables were being cleaned, not through revolution, but through careful, practical attention to the work that truly mattered. The decision to pursue Pompey across the sea was the most difficult calculation of my career. Rome needed stability, not another campaign. My men deserved rest after years in Gaul and the march south. Yet letting Pompey regroup in Greece would only prolong the civil war, costing more lives in the long run. I stood on the Ostia docks watching the winter waves, remembering the young Pompey who had cleared pirates from these same waters. Now I would chase him across them. The irony tasted bitter. We had been allies, family, fellow Romans. Now geography and politics made us enemies. The naval preparations were a nightmare of logistics. Pompey had taken most of Rome's fleet east with him, leaving us with barely enough ships to transport 2 legions. I stood with my engineers on the beach, calculating how to make inadequate resources serve necessary purposes. We commandeered fishing boats, reinforced transports, built landing craft from whatever timber we could find. The soldiers worked alongside sailors, their land-bound habits adapting to maritime needs. They trusted me enough to follow onto these makeshift vessels, though I saw the unease in their eyes as they watched the grey winter sea. We sailed in rough weather, the ships riding low in the water with the weight of men and supplies. The crossing felt like crossing the Rubicon again, another boundary between certainty and risk, another step into the unknown. I stood at the prow, the salt spray stinging my face, watching the Italian coast recede. Behind me lay Rome, finally at peace under our administration. Ahead lay Greece, where Pompey was gathering legions from the eastern provinces. The sea itself seemed to mirror my divided heart. Part of me wanted to stay and build the new Rome we had begun, but the greater part knew that lasting peace required confronting the threat before it grew stronger. The landing in Epirus was unopposed, our arrival apparently unexpected. As my boots touched Greek soil, I felt the shift in context. This was no longer about defending Italy, but about pursuing a war across foreign lands. The local towns watched with nervous curiosity as Roman legions moved through their olive groves and rocky hills. They had no stake in our civil war, yet their lands would become our battlefield. I gave strict orders: respect local property, pay for all supplies, leave no damage in our passage. This was a conflict between Romans, and Greeks should not suffer for our disagreements. The campaign that followed became a strange dance across the Greek landscape. Pompey avoided direct engagement, using his naval superiority to keep us guessing while he gathered more forces. We marched through winter rains and spring thaws. Our supplies often stretched thin. The soldiers never complained, their discipline held through hunger and hardship, their belief in our cause unshaken. I made a point of sharing their conditions, eating the same rations, sleeping in the same tents. Leadership in hardship isn't about giving orders from comfort. It's about sharing the burden until the burden becomes bearable through shared purpose. The strategy was simple: force engagement before Pompey's reinforcements arrived from the east. We manoeuvred, feinted, probed for weaknesses in his positions. The waiting was the hardest part, the knowledge that every day brought new legions to his banner, while we had only what we had brought across the sea. Yet in the quiet moments around campfires, I sensed something shifting. Pompey's hesitation to engage, his reliance on numbers rather than boldness, these were not the signs of a commander confident in his cause. He was gathering an army, but he had lost something more important: the decisive spirit that wins battles. And as the spring days lengthened, I knew our moment would come. The chase would end where all chases must, face to face on the field where fate decides. The morning of the battle dawned clear and still. The Greek plains spread before us like a gaming board where fate would roll its dice. I stood watching Pompey's forces array themselves across the ridge, legion upon legion gleaming in the early light, cavalry massing on the flanks, the sheer numbers enough to make any commander hesitate. My own forces looked pitiful by comparison, seasoned veterans but desperately outnumbered. Yet numbers alone don't win battles. Discipline, positioning, and the will to fight for something beyond yourself matter more. I walked among my men that morning, not with false confidence, but with quiet assurance. They knew what was at stake, knew that today would decide whether our crossing of the Rubicon would become the birth of a new Rome or a footnote in someone else's history. The battle began with Pompey's cavalry charge, a magnificent, terrifying sight as thousands of horsemen thundered across the plain toward our right flank. This was his masterstroke. His overwhelming force meant to crush us quickly. But we had prepared for this. I had stationed my weakest infantry in that sector, knowing they would appear to buckle. As the cavalry pressed forward, confident of victory, my hidden reserve of elite troops emerged from behind the lines. They didn't fight with swords as expected, but with specially prepared pikes aimed at the horses' faces. The animals reared in panic, throwing riders, creating chaos where order had been moments before. The seemingly weak infantry now pressed forward, and the mighty cavalry charge dissolved into confusion. I watched from the command position, my heart pounding not with fear but with that strange calm that comes when a calculated risk proves correct. The main infantry lines engaged then, the sound of shield meeting shield like thunder rolling across the plain. Here, our veterans' discipline showed its worth. While Pompey's newer levies fought bravely, they lacked the coordination of men who had campaigned together for years. Our smaller units moved with practiced precision, supporting each other, filling gaps, maintaining formation under pressure. I saw centurions I knew personally, men who had served with me in Gaul, directing their troops with calm authority. They weren't just fighting against something, they were fighting for the promise of the Rome we believed possible. That belief became our invisible advantage, the extra strength that turns the tide when metal meets metal and will determine outcome. The critical moment came when Pompey's left flank began to crumble under our sustained pressure. I could see the uncertainty spreading through their ranks, the hesitation that precedes collapse. At that instant I committed my final reserve. Fresh troops held back for this precise moment. They hit the wavering line like a hammer striking weakened stone. The break began as a small fissure, then became a rupture, then a full collapse. Pompey's forces, so confident in their numbers just hours before, now streamed backward in disarray. The battle wasn't won with brilliant tactics alone, but with something deeper: the trust between commander and soldiers, the shared belief in their cause, the discipline forged through campaigns where every man knew his comrades would hold the line. As the dust settled on the field, I walked among the fallen, Roman lying beside Roman, and felt the weight of what we had done. This wasn't a victory over foreign enemies. It was Romans killing Romans. The very tragedy I had hoped to avoid. The cost of saving the Republic was written in the faces of the dead on both sides. When they brought me Pompey's abandoned command tent still filled with his maps and personal effects, the triumph felt hollow. We had won the battle, but the real victory would be whether we could build a Rome worth such sacrifice. The plain at Pharsalus would forever hold the echo of that question. Was any cause worth this price in Roman blood? The news arrived not with triumph, but with a strange hollow feeling in the chest. Pompey had reached Egypt, seeking refuge with the young pharaoh Ptolemy, whose father we'd both supported. The messenger's words hung in the air between us, assassinated on the beach as he stepped from his boat, cut down by supposed allies who thought they were doing me a favour. I had to sit down when I heard, the campaign tent suddenly feeling too small, too close. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not for the man who had been my son-in-law, my ally, the greatest general of his generation before our paths diverged. We were supposed to debate in the Senate afterward, find some accommodation, remember what we had built together before ambition tore us apart. The details emerged slowly, each more bitter than the last. He had been stabbed in the back while reading a message, denied even a soldier's clean death facing his enemies. His head was kept as a trophy, his body left on the shoreline for the waves. The pettiness of it shamed us all. Roman against Roman was tragedy enough, but this desecration spoke of something darker in human nature. I gave orders that his remains be recovered and given proper rights, that his killers be punished. The gestures felt inadequate, like trying to mend a shattered vase with mere words. Some fractures cannot be healed, only acknowledged. In the quiet of my tent that night, I found myself remembering not the rival he became, but the man he had been. The young general clearing pirates from the Mediterranean, the reformer who stood with me against Senate corruption, the husband who loved my daughter with such evident devotion. The tragedy wasn't just his death, but the wasted potential of what we might have accomplished together for Rome. We had allowed personal ambition and political calculation to override shared purpose, and now the Mediterranean carried his blood while I remained to face the consequences alone. Victory should taste sweet, but this one left only ashes. The bitter understanding that winning a war doesn't always mean winning what matters. The Egyptian coast appeared through the sea haze like a dream of another world. Pale sand meeting turquoise water, strange birds circling above reed boats, the distant smell of spices and decay. We landed with caution, my reduced forces tense after the long voyage. Alexandria rose before us, her famous lighthouse a needle against the sky, her palaces white and golden in the harsh light. This was supposed to be refuge, resupply, a pause to regroup before continuing the pursuit. Instead, we stepped into a viper's nest of royal intrigue that made Roman politics seem simple by comparison. The young pharaoh Ptolemy sent officials who bowed with elaborate courtesy, but whose eyes calculated everything. They offered provisions but no welcome, assistance but no commitment. I soon understood why. Egypt itself was divided by civil war between the boy king and his sister Cleopatra. Our arrival became another piece in their deadly game. The courtiers surrounding Ptolemy saw us as either threat or tool, never as guests. I kept my soldiers disciplined, our camp orderly, but felt the tension rising like Nile floodwaters. Every courtesy masked a calculation, every gift carried hidden intentions. Then came the night everything changed. A servant arrived at my tent with a strange bundle, an ornate carpet that, when unrolled, revealed not patterns but a living woman. Cleopatra emerged from those folds like wisdom from mystery, her eyes taking in everything without seeming to look. She didn't apologize for the dramatic entrance. She simply began speaking about Egyptian politics with a clarity her brother's advisers lacked. Here was no puppet waiting for others to move her. This was a queen who understood power because she had been fighting for it since childhood. Her intelligence shone brighter than any jewel she might have worn. We spoke through the night, the oil lamps casting shifting shadows as she explained the complex loyalties and betrayals of her court. She didn't ask for help. She offered alliance based on mutual interest. Rome needed Egyptian grain and stability. She needed Roman recognition to secure her throne. The simplicity of the exchange felt refreshing after the double meanings of her brother's court. Yet even as we spoke, I sensed the danger. This was no simple political marriage of convenience. There was a sharp mind behind those eyes, a will that matched my own, an understanding that power is never given, only taken. The days that followed became a delicate dance of diplomacy and threat. Ptolemy's advisers, realizing Cleopatra had outmaneuvered them, began plotting in earnest. I felt the net tightening, whispers in the corridors, guards becoming suddenly scarce, supplies delayed for administrative reasons. The Alexandrians themselves watched with mixed curiosity and hostility, their loyalty to their rulers complicated by distrust of foreign soldiers. We were swimming with crocodiles, as the saying goes. Every movement had to be calculated, every gesture measured against multiple interpretations. The warmth of the Egyptian sun contrasted with the cold calculations unfolding in shadowed rooms. When the attack finally came, it felt almost like relief. The tension of waiting broken by the clarity of action. Ptolemy's forces moved against our compound without warning, their numbers swelling with armed citizens stirred by anti-Roman rhetoric. We barricaded the palace district, our veterans adapting to urban fighting with grim efficiency. The battle became a street-by-street struggle, our discipline against their numbers, our experience against their knowledge of the maze-like city. Through it all, Cleopatra remained calm, directing her own loyal forces with a commander's eye. In that chaos, I saw the truth. Egypt would never be a passive prize. It would be a partner or an enemy, but never a possession. And the woman who had arrived in a carpet held more power in her quiet calculations than all her brother's armies. The fighting in Alexandria's narrow streets became a different kind of war. Not the ordered clash of legions on an open field, but a desperate house-to-house struggle where every balcony might hide an archer and every alley could conceal an ambush. We fortified the palace district, turning elegant marble colonnades into defensive barricades. My veterans, so accustomed to fighting in Gaul's forests and Greece's plains, now adapted to urban combat with grim determination. They barred doors, secured rooftops, created choke points in gardens meant for pleasure. The beauty of Alexandria became a deadly maze, its splendour now a battlefield. We were badly outnumbered, surrounded by a city that saw us as invaders. Ptolemy's forces, combined with armed citizens stirred by nationalist rhetoric, pressed from all sides. The famous library quarter became a no-man's land. The museum's halls echoed with the sounds of combat instead of scholarship. Yet our discipline held. Each soldier knew his position, trusted his comrades, followed orders with a precision that had won battles across the Republic. I moved among them, not as a distant commander, but as a fellow soldier sharing the danger. Leadership in crisis isn't about giving orders from safety. It's about standing where the arrows fly and showing that the risk is shared. The turning point came when we secured the harbour, fighting our way to the docks through streets running with blood and seawater. Control of the port meant reinforcements could reach us. Supplies could get through. I had sent urgent messages to our allies in Asia Minor, and now their ships began arriving, first in trickles, then in steady streams. The sight of fresh legions disembarking broke the Alexandrians' confidence. They had believed they were besieging us. Now they found themselves caught between our veterans inside the city and new forces landing at their backs. The final battle for the palace was short and brutal. Ptolemy's forces, realizing their position was hopeless, made one last desperate assault. We met them in the great courtyard where fountains once played, now stained with blood. When the fighting ended, the young king was dead. Drowned in the Nile during the retreat, they said. His sister Cleopatra emerged from the secured chambers where we'd protected her, now unquestioned ruler of Egypt. The cost had been high. Roman and Egyptian blood soaked into the beautiful stones of Alexandria, but the outcome was clear. Sometimes the crocodiles must be fought in their own waters before any alliance can be secure. The campaign in Asia Minor unfolded with that strange clarity that comes when fortune favours boldness. We moved with purpose through territories that had been loyal to Pompey, expecting resistance that never truly materialised. The Battle of Zela was less a battle than a decisive demonstration. Farnes's forces crumbled before our veterans' discipline, their confidence broken before their lines even properly engaged. As I surveyed the field afterward, the phrase came to me not as boast, but as simple report. I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words that captured the efficiency of the campaign, the way overwhelming force applied with precision can resolve conflicts without prolonged bloodshed. The locals watched with relief rather than fear. They had expected plunder and received orderly administration instead. The real victory wasn't the battle itself, but what followed. I spent weeks reorganising the province's administration, settling disputes between cities, ensuring tax collection would be fair and transparent. These were the unglamorous tasks of governance that truly secure peace. The legend of Veni, Vidi, Vici would grow in the telling, but the truth was simpler. Sometimes showing strength with restraint achieves more than endless campaigns. The Eastern territories needed stability more than dramatic victories, and that stability became the real prize. As we prepare to return to Rome, I felt the weight of unfinished work waiting, not military campaigns, but the harder task of building a peace worthy of the sacrifices made. The journey back to Rome felt different from our departure. We returned not as rebels, but as victors, the dust of Eastern campaign still on our boots, but the weight of governance settling on our shoulders. The Italian countryside greeted us with harvest rather than hesitation, fields golden with wheat instead of winter bareness, farmers waving from their lands rather than watching nervously from doorways. This was the Italy we had fought for, the peace we had secured, and the responsibility felt heavier than any battle standard I'd ever carried. The city itself seemed to breathe differently as we approached. Where before had been the quiet of fear, now emerged the busy hum of normal life. Market stalls overflowing with autumn produce, construction sounds from repaired aqueducts, children playing in streets that had been empty months before. The people watched our procession not with apprehension but with curiosity, their faces showing the cautious hope of those who have endured crisis and now dare to believe in stability. I made a point of riding without armour, my toga instead of military cloak, the symbol of civilian authority rather than military power. The Senate chamber that had stood empty now filled with nervous energy as I convened the remaining senators. Their numbers were diminished. Many had fled with Pompey, some had retired to their estates, a few had passed from age or illness during the conflict. Those who remained watched me with expressions ranging from grudging acceptance to open anxiety. I took my place not on the dictator's throne but on a consul's chair, the gesture deliberate. "We are here to restore the Republic, not replace it," I began, and saw shoulders relax slightly around the chamber. The work would be slow, the trust earned gradually, but the direction was set, not toward monarchy, but toward renewal. The practical governance continued, but now with broader scope. The debt relief measures showed results. Markets buzzed with activity as citizens with manageable burdens began to spend and trade again. Veterans settled on their new lands sent letters describing first harvests, the pride in their words more valuable than any tribute. The calendar reform began to take effect, the seasons aligning properly with festivals and planting cycles for the first time in generations. Yet with each reform, I felt the tension between necessary authority and republican traditions. The people needed strong leadership to recover from years of corruption, but Rome's soul depended on eventually restoring proper balances of power. The changes extended beyond economics into social structures. I expanded citizenship to more provincial communities, recognizing that Rome had grown beyond her original hills. The Senate itself gained new members from across Italy, and even the provinces, men of merit rather than just birth. The old aristocrats watched these changes with discomfort, but the people welcomed them as signs of a more inclusive future. Yet with each innovation, I monitored my own power carefully. The dictatorship remained temporary in my mind, its purpose healing rather than ruling. The true test would come not in exercising authority, but in relinquishing it when the Republic could stand on its own feet again. As autumn turned toward winter, Rome felt more stable than it had in years. The courts functioned, the grain supply flowed steadily, the streets remained safe. But beneath the surface calm, I sensed the unresolved questions. The aristocrats who had opposed me watched and waited, their loyalty conditional on my continued success. The people supported me, but their affection felt like a trust that could be withdrawn if I failed them. And always, the ghost of Pompey's fate reminded me that victory creates its own vulnerabilities. Rome was healing, but the medicine of strong authority carried its own poison if administered too long or too strongly. The work continued, but the greatest challenge remained, not conquering enemies, but conquering the temptation to make temporary power permanent. The calendar project began as a practical necessity, but became something more profound. an attempt to align human time with cosmic truth. Our Roman calendar had drifted so far out of sync with the solar year that spring festivals fell in winter and harvest celebrations arrived before planting. This wasn't just administrative sloppiness. It represented how disconnected our leadership had become from natural rhythms. I consulted with the best astronomers from Alexandria, their knowledge of the stars far surpassing our own. Together we calculated the precise length of the solar year and designed a new system that would keep time properly for centuries. The mathematics fascinated me, the elegant dance of numbers that could capture the Earth's journey around the sun. When we implemented the change, adding 67 days to correct the drift, it felt like bringing order to chaos itself. Time would now flow properly in Rome, a quiet symbol that reason and organisation could overcome even the most entrenched disorder. The month they named July in my honour felt less like tribute and more like responsibility, a reminder that true legacy isn't in conquests alone, but in creating systems that serve people long after we're gone. This alignment of human measurement with celestial reality became a metaphor for the larger work of governance. Just as the calendar needed correction to match the truth of seasons, our laws and administration needed reform to match the truth of human dignity. The project required patience, explaining the changes to priests who scheduled festivals, farmers who planted by traditional markers, officials who kept records. But gradually the new rhythm took hold. The winter solstice actually arrived in winter, the spring equinox in spring. This quiet precision felt more meaningful than any military triumph. It demonstrated that Rome could evolve, could improve, could align itself with larger truths beyond immediate power struggles. The calendar reform would outlast all of us, a silent witness to the idea that even time itself could be made to serve the cause of order and understanding. Sometimes the most enduring changes come not from dramatic actions, but from careful attention to the fundamental structures that shape our lives. The opposition that began with political manoeuvring gradually hardened into something more dangerous. Men who had once debated me in the Senate now whispered in shadowed corridors, their principles curdling into conspiracy. The warnings came through trusted channels. Cicero's carefully worded letters suggesting I take more precautions, loyal officers reporting strange gatherings at certain villas, servants mentioning whispered conversations that stopped when others approached. I dismissed some concerns as natural political friction, but the pattern became too clear to ignore. These weren't just dissatisfied senators, they were men plotting the ultimate response to perceived tyranny. The irony cut deepest with Brutus, a man I had forgiven after he fought for Pompey, a protégé I'd welcomed back and promoted to high office. His involvement in the plotting, when confirmed, felt like a personal failure. I had believed merit could overcome family legacy, that my faith in his character could outweigh the influence of his aristocratic connections. Yet the ghost of his ancestor who expelled the kings seemed to whisper louder than any loyalty to the present. The other conspirators were easier to understand. Cassius with his personal grudges, Casca with his traditionalist fervour, the rest with their various mixtures of idealism and ambition. But Brutus? His potential betrayal kept me awake at night, wondering where I had failed to earn the trust I had so freely given. The security measures felt increasingly oppressive. The German bodyguards who shadowed my movements, the food tasters at formal dinners, the careful screening of visitors. Each precaution seemed to acknowledge the very fear my opponents wanted to instill. I found myself studying faces during Senate meetings, watching for the slight hesitation before a greeting, the extra formality that might mask conspiracy. The paranoia felt beneath me, unworthy of a Roman leader. yet the threats were too specific to ignore. Even my wife Calpurnia begged me to take greater care, her dreams filled with ominous visions that science couldn't explain but intuition couldn't dismiss. The final warning came on the morning of the Edis itself. The Haruspex Spirina, whose divinations are usually respected as tradition rather than truth, took my hand with unusual urgency. The sacrifice showed great danger, he insisted, his eyes serious. Beware the next 30 days. I laughed it off publicly. A leader cannot show fear, but privately the warning settled in my stomach like cold stone. The combination of religious omen and practical intelligence created a perfect storm of doubt. Yet even then, part of me refused to believe Romans would resort to assassination. We were not some barbarian tribe settling disputes with daggers. We were the heirs of a republic that debated its differences openly. That faith, as it turned out, would be my final miscalculation. The morning felt different somehow, a quality of light that seemed both too sharp and too soft, the way time slows in moments before disaster. I dismissed Calpurnia's fears with a husband's patience, though her dreams had been unusually vivid. The Senate awaited, and despite the warnings, I believed in the sanctity of that chamber too deeply to hide from shadows. The walk to the Senate house felt both familiar and strange, each step carrying the weight of all the mornings I'd taken this path, as young senator, as consul, as reformer. The crowds along the way seemed more subdued than usual, their greetings carrying a tension that had nothing to do with respect. I noticed small things. A group of senators clustered too tightly near the portico, Brutus avoiding my gaze when normally he would approach, the way the sunlight caught the hilt of a dagger beneath a folded toga. Yet the mind has a remarkable capacity to explain away what it does not wish to see. I told myself it was just the tension of politics, the natural friction of power. The Haruspex's warning echoed, but I pushed it aside. A republic ruled by superstition is no republic at all. The chamber felt unusually still as I entered, the usual murmur of conversation replaced by a waiting silence. The senators stood in small groups that seemed to rearrange themselves as I moved toward my seat. I remember the quality of the light through the high windows, how it fell across the marble floor in sharp angles, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Tilius Cimber approached with a petition, his manner too earnest, his eyes not meeting mine. As I gestured him away, the movement felt like a signal. The first blow came from behind, a sharp, surprised pain between my shoulders. Then they were upon me, not as debaters or politicians, but as men possessed by some collective madness. I saw faces I knew, men I had pardoned, promoted, trusted, their features twisted by something beyond reason. The last thing I saw was Brutus raising his dagger, and in that final moment the question wasn't about power or politics, but about how love could turn to this. The darkness that followed felt less like an ending, and more like a door closing on a question that would echo through centuries. The silence in the Senate chamber felt heavier than any battle's aftermath. My body lay where it fell, the marble now stained with what had moments before been life and purpose. The assassins stood frozen in their sudden victory, their bloody daggers hanging limp in hands that now trembled with the reality of what they had done. The other senators, those not part of the conspiracy, stared in horrified disbelief, their mouths open in silent screams that would later find voice. In that first breathless moment there was no triumph, only the shocking understanding that they had shattered something that could not be repaired. The sacred space where Rome had debated her destiny for centuries now witnessed her unravelling in real time. Chaos erupted slowly at first, then with overwhelming force. Senators tripped over benches in their panic to escape. their togas tearing on the very furniture where they had once debated law and order. The conspirators themselves seemed surprised by the violence they had unleashed, their political idealism crumbling before the physical reality of assassination. They had imagined themselves as liberators restoring the Republic, but the terrified faces fleeing around them told a different story. They had become murderers in a sacred space, and the weight of that transformation began to settle even as the blood still spread across the floor. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythms, unaware that its heart had just stopped beating. Market vendors called their wares, children played in the streets, the afternoon sun warmed the same stones it had warmed for centuries. The disconnect between the horror inside the Senate and the normalcy outside felt like the ultimate indictment of their act. They had killed not a tyrant, but the stability that allowed ordinary life to continue. As the first screams reached the Forum, that normalcy would shatter too, but in those first moments, Rome continued breathing while her destiny bled out on the marble floor. The assassins' miscalculation revealed itself immediately. They had expected the people to rise in gratitude for liberating them from supposed tyranny. Instead, the initial public reaction was disbelief, then anger, then raw fear. Shopkeepers closed their shutters not in celebration but in dread. Parents gathered children from streets suddenly grown dangerous. The very stability I had worked to restore, the debt relief, the secure grain supply, the orderly administration, now felt threatened by this return to political violence. The people understood something the idealistic senators did not. That order, even imperfect order, is preferable to chaos. Their quiet withdrawal from public spaces spoke louder than any cheering crowd could have. In the coming hours, as news spread through the city, a strange quiet would descend, the silence of a people holding their breath, waiting to see what would follow. The conspirators would attempt to frame their act as noble liberation, but the blood on their hands would speak a language more primal than politics. They had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed, and in doing so, they had not saved the Republic. They had unleashed the very forces that would end it forever. The immediate aftermath was not victory, but the beginning of an ending that would echo through centuries, all originating from that single moment when idealism turned to violence in the afternoon light. The Republic I had tried to save died not with my assassination, but with the arrangements that followed. Octavian, my nephew and heir, formed an alliance with Antony and Lepidus, the second triumvirate that would finish what the first began. They claimed to act in my name, to avenge my murder, but their methods betrayed every principle I had fought for. The proscription list they posted contained not just my enemies' names, but those of anyone with wealth they coveted. The violence that followed made Sulla's purges look restrained. I watched from beyond the veil as Rome descended into the very bloodbath I had worked to prevent. My name used to justify atrocities that would have sickened the reformer I once was. Octavian, the careful, calculating youth I had mentored, proved more ruthless than any of us. He played Antony's military brashness against Lepidus's weakness, gradually concentrating power until only he remained. The Republic's forms continued, Senate meetings, elections, legal procedures, but the substance had vanished. What emerged was not the restored Republic I had envisioned, but the imperial system that would define Rome for centuries. The irony tasted bitter. In trying to save the Republic from corruption, I had set in motion the forces that would replace it with empire. My crossing of the Rubicon became not a rescue mission, but the first step toward a different Rome altogether. The true tragedy unfolded in the generations that followed. The Caesars who came after, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, would bear my name but none of my ideals. They wielded absolute power without the sense of responsibility that had guided my actions. The people I had sought to empower became subjects rather than citizens. The reforms I had implemented to create a more just society became tools for maintaining control. The river I crossed to save the Republic ultimately led to its end, not because I sought empire, but because the forces unleashed could not be contained. Some boundaries, once crossed, change everything forever, and the consequences ripple through history in ways no one can fully predict. The system that emerged from the Civil War bore little resemblance to the Republic I had tried to save. My crossing of the Rubicon meant to restore balance, instead became the gateway to imperial rule. The Caesars who followed, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, would wield power I never sought, their authority absolute where mine had been temporary. They kept the Senate's forms but emptied them of meaning, maintaining the theatre of republicanism while ruling as emperors. The people traded political freedom for stability, and perhaps that was the tragedy, that after centuries of republican government, they accepted autocracy as the price of peace. The imperial legacy stretched across centuries, each Caesar adding layers to the system I had unintentionally created. The very name Caesar became synonymous with power itself, adopted by emperors in Rome and later by rulers as distant as Russia and Germany. The irony was profound. The man who crossed a river to prevent dictatorship became the namesake for dictators throughout history. My reforms, the calendar, the debt relief, the citizenship expansions continued, but they served an imperial system rather than a republican one. The engine of governance continued, but the driver was no longer the people's will. Historians would debate for millennia whether the Republic could have been saved, or whether it was already too corrupted to survive. They would analyse my decisions at the Rubicon, weighing the immediate crisis against the long-term consequences. Some would call me a tyrant who destroyed Roman liberty. Others would see a reformer who recognised that sometimes systems must be broken to be remade. The truth, I suspect, lies in understanding that history rarely offers perfect choices, only choices between imperfect paths. The Rubicon's true lesson may be that moments of decision define not just individual lives, but the course of civilizations. That January night set in motion changes that would shape Western history for 2,000 years. The transition from republic to empire, the spread of Roman law and culture, the creation of a model of governance that would influence nations yet unborn. The river itself became a metaphor for points of no return in countless lives, a symbol of decisions that change everything. And perhaps that is the final irony, that a shallow stream in northern Italy became one of history's most enduring symbols because one general chose to cross it, believing he was saving what he ultimately transformed. What if I had chosen differently at that river's edge? The question haunts the space between history and memory. If I had turned back, disbanded my legions, returned to Rome as the Senate demanded, would the Republic have survived? Or would it have continued its slow decay into the very corruption I sought to heal? The aristocrats would have reclaimed their privileges, my veterans would have been cheated of their due, and the people's hopes for reform would have been buried beneath more decades of entrenched power. Sometimes the greater risk lies not in action, but in inaction when change is desperately needed. The alternative paths shimmer like mirages, perhaps a negotiated settlement, a political compromise that spared Rome's civil war. But Pompey had already chosen his side, and Cato would never have accepted anything less than my complete political destruction. The system had become too rigid, too corrupted by personal hatreds disguised as principles. Maybe the Republic needed this crisis to be purified, much as a forest fire clears away the undergrowth so new growth can emerge. The tragedy isn't that we fought, but that the healing afterward required more autocracy than any of us intended. The necessity of my action lives not in the battles won, but in the reforms implemented, the debt relief that saved thousands from ruin, the land grants that gave veterans dignity, the calendar that brought order to time itself. These practical improvements touched ordinary lives in ways Senate debates never could. The people understood this. Their quiet support during our march south wasn't for rebellion, but for the promise of a Rome that worked for all its citizens, not just the privileged few. Sometimes breaking rules is the only way to serve the greater good they were meant to protect. History's judgment continues to unfold through centuries, each generation seeing my choices through its own lens. Some call me a tyrant, others a visionary reformer. The truth likely lives in the understanding that leaders face choices between imperfect options, and the full consequences only reveal themselves long after the decision is made. The Rubicon taught me that some boundaries exist to be crossed when they no longer serve their original purpose. The river flows on, indifferent to the general who once hesitated on its banks, its waters continuing their journey to the sea just as history continues its relentless flow toward truths we can only glimpse from our limited perspective in time. So I ask you again, what would you have done when faced with your Rubicon? Not necessarily a river, but that moment when the rules say stop, but your conscience says go forward. That choice between safety and necessity, between what is legal and what is right. We all face these crossings in our lives. The job that requires compromising values, the relationship that demands sacrificing self-respect, the quiet moment when you must choose between comfort and growth. My Rubicon was literal, but yours might be just as real in its consequences. The river taught me that some boundaries exist not to limit us, but to define the moments that shape our character. That cold water swirling in the darkness became the line between who I had been and who I needed to become. The true crossing wasn't the physical steps through the current, but the internal acceptance that some decisions cannot be unmade. Some paths once taken define everything that follows. The water flows onward, indifferent to our struggles, but we remain changed by what we dared to do at its edge. History remembers the grand consequences, the wars, the empires, the shifting of civilizations. But the personal lesson is simpler. We are defined not by the boundaries we respect, but by the ones we cross for what we believe is right. The river doesn't judge, it merely flows. The judgment comes from within, from that quiet place where we know whether we acted from courage or fear, from principle or ambition. My Rubicon moment passed into legend, but your Rubicon moments await in the quiet choices of your own life. What will the river say about you when you stand at its edge? That night by the Rubicon contained more than just military calculation. It held the quiet truth that every life reaches moments where the path forward demands crossing into the unknown. As I stood there watching the dark water flow, I wasn't just a general considering strategy. I was a man facing the sum of all his choices. The cold air, the distant campfires, the loyal soldiers waiting. These became the setting for the ultimate question. Can one break the rules to save what those rules were meant to protect? The answer didn't come from political theory or military advantage. It emerged from the simple understanding that sometimes systems become so corrupted that working within them means perpetuating their failures. The Republic wasn't just a set of laws and traditions. It was an ideal of governance that had been hijacked by men who cared more about privilege than principle. Crossing that river meant trusting that the people would understand the difference between rebellion against Rome and rebellion against those who had betrayed her. In the stillness of that night, I realized that history would judge this moment not by its legality, but by its necessity. The same Romans who revered their laws also understood that extraordinary times demand extraordinary actions. The true meaning of that night wasn't about my personal ambition. It was about recognizing that some boundaries must be crossed to preserve what they were created to defend. The river flowed on, indifferent to generals and senators, but its waters carried the future of everything I loved. Thank you for walking this path with me through memory and history. As you reflect on your own life's crossings, remember that rivers take many forms, some visible, some hidden in the heart. If these quiet journeys into the past have brought you peace or perspective, consider subscribing for more moments where history speaks in whispers rather than shouts. Where should we travel together next? Another night, another choice, another soul standing where destiny and decision meet. The stories continue, and your company makes the journey meaningful.